Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our sponsor of our podcast, The Great Courses Plus. This is the teaching company's The Great Courses, which I've been listening to for decades. They have thousands of professionally produced college courses or courses taught by college professors, the best in the country. And they've introduced a app for your phone. It's thegreatcoursesplus.com. And so you just touch the app and you open up the course you want to listen to. The one I just started this week is on Understanding the Old Testament by Professor Robert D. Miller II. So just to give you an idea of how it works, you just touch on the lecture you want to listen to. Like number 1 is the Old Testament as literature. Number 2 is the Genesis creation story. I'm right now on lecture 3, What God Intended for Adam and Eve. Oh boy, this should be interesting. In any case, this is great because you can skip around. If I find one of the lectures boring, I just skip to the next one. You can do it on audio or video and all from your phone. It's a terrific way to consume content, particularly during social isolation. During the pandemic, it's a great way to become an autodidact. So if you want to know more, you can, if you sign up through my podcast, then you get a free trial. So go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon, and you get a free trial with free access to the entire library of all these hundreds and hundreds of courses and thousands of lectures. So with that, I'll introduce my next guest. My guest today is Dr. Debra Soh. Her new book is, here's the audio version on my phone, The End of Gender. Oh no. Well, she's debunking the myths about sex and identity in our society. Anyway, we talk about pretty much all the super hot button, very controversial issues here, including, I just give you a short list here, the difference between sex and gender, what percentage of LGBTQ, depending on which one you're talking about, of the population identifies as such, the difference between being identified as a certain gender versus who you're attracted to, individual behavior versus collective labels of behavior, sexual orientation and gender identity, gender-neutral parenting, gender dysphoria, the implications of all this for men and women dating. We talk about trans bathrooms, trans prisons, military, etc., sports, trans sports, and to what extent is that fair? So we cover all the big topics there. So Dr. Debra Soh is a neuroscientist who specializes in gender, sex, and sexual orientation. She received her doctorate from York University in Toronto and worked as an academic researcher for 11 years. Her writing has appeared in the Globe and Mail in Toronto, Harper's Magazine, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Scientific American, Playboy, Quillette, and many other publications. Her research has been published in academic journals, including the Archives of Sexual Behavior and Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. As a journalist, Soh writes about the science and politics of human sexuality and gender, free speech, and censorship in academia. She lives in Toronto and divides her time between New York and Los Angeles. Well, she used to, pre-COVID. You can follow Debra on Twitter at Dr. Debra Soh, DrDebraSoh, and visit her at drdebrasoh.com. And with that, I give you Dr. Debra Soh. So we're talking on the Friday of your launch week. How's it going so far this week, given the background of your attacks by the cancel culture people, and you do have your critics?
It's been good. I mean, I fully expected that, so it's been fine, and I'm basically used to it at this point.
Right. Well, for most of my podcast episodes, I like to dive into the topic through some weird, quirky story. So here's the one from for you from last night. So oftentimes I'll fall asleep early with my son. He's 4 years old. And then I wake up at like midnight and I can't fall back asleep. So I queue up some Netflix binge watching or Star Trek: The Next Generation. I've been going through all the episodes from the 90s that I missed back then. So just totally by chance, the next one in the queue was an episode called Outcast. Now, mind you, this was broadcast in 1992. So the Star Trek Enterprise encounters this humanoid race of androgynous people called the Janali, for whom they have no expression of male or female gender. In fact, if you express any kind of preference for a gender is considered a perversion, and you have to go through this treatment called psychotectic therapy, which erases all sense of any kind of gender whatsoever. And now, weirdly, all of the characters are clearly played by women, kind of, I guess, not so feminine-looking women. I don't know how you describe them, short hair, and they probably had their chest bound or something like that because they were trying to look gender neutral, I suppose. But so again, the theme of the episode was that it's okay to express your preferred gender. It's not a perversion. And this was a commentary on the sort of gay rights movement in the early 90s. So Commander Riker falls in love with one of the characters named Soren, who is identifying as a female when she's not supposed to. So they get caught, and then she's put on trial, and then she gives this little speech. I'll read you the speech because it's kind of revealing for what we're talking about. She says, "I am female. I was born that way. I have had those feelings, those longings all of my life. It is not unnatural. I'm not sick because I feel this way. I do not need to be helped. I do not need to be cured. What I need and what all of those who are like me need is your understanding and your compassion. We have not injured you in any way, and yet you are scorned and we are scorned and attacked, and all because we are different." And then she goes on and on about this, we're not criminals and so on. And I thought, that's a pretty interesting commentary, because in a way, that was the theme in the 90s, that pushing back against the religious right, who said it's a lifestyle choice to be gay and you made the wrong choice, so we can help you convert back to normalcy. And this argument that was becoming popular at the time through the people you discuss in your book, like Simon LeVay and Michael Bailey, is that, no, there are biological differences. We didn't choose to be this way. We're just this way biologically. And weirdly, the arguments you're making in your book is, it seems like this is now reversed, that biology is not making you that way. You can be any way you want. So it's kind of a weird pushback against the traditional gay arguments that they're born that way and therefore it's not a lifestyle choice.
Right. To be clear, so when I in the book I do talk about how there's this argument that sexual orientation is not biological and that it can be whatever you want. That's definitely not the position I'm taking. I'm definitely saying no, sexual orientation is indeed biological, and I do, cite work by Simon LeVay and Michael Bailey that speaks to that also. But that's such a funny coincidence that you just happened to see that episode last night.
It is weird. Yeah, and Jonathan Frakes, who played Commander Riker, said he felt they didn't go far enough, that they should have. Well, it ends when he goes down to the planet to rescue her and take her away, and she's already gone through the therapy, and she tells him, no, I was a pervert back then. I'm back to normal now. And he's like, oh, no. So, again, that sort of commentary on, well, at the time, we were critical of the religious right for being creationists. And now we're experiencing what I call cognitive creationism by people on the left, that, as you say, from the neck up, biology doesn't have any effect at all. It's such a weird approach to take, considering this background of the gay rights movement that was pushing for there being biological differences.
Right. And I would say, coming from the field of sex research, and I now work as a journalist full time, but my background is as an academic sex researcher. Previously we would deal with most political interference coming from, as you mentioned, the right. Not all right-leaning people have an issue with sex research, but definitely I would say now there's a bigger threat coming from the political left. And I would consider myself to be a liberal still. I'm certainly not far left, but definitely in terms of the interference, and it's really gotten a greater foothold, I would say, because within sex research, most researchers are left-leaning. So when it's coming from your own side, it's almost more difficult to see it coming and to know how to fight it. But I would say science denial on both sides is equally harmful. And, the whole gay rights movement, I'm a big supporter of gay rights, was predicated on this idea that sexual orientation is biological. We were born this way. It's not a choice. I think at the end of the day, whatever you're into sexually, whether it's biological or a choice, as long as it's consensual, there should be no judgment there and it's perfectly acceptable. But I really don't, I find it worrisome that anything that has to do with biology now really is being denigrated, particularly among left-leaning activists. And I have a whole chapter in the book devoted to talking about why social justice and activism is completely inappropriate for it to be in academia and within sex research.
Yeah, it seems like that you have been, I don't know if it would say canceled, but you've certainly been attacked. You're, female, Asian, pro-choice, pro-feminine, female rights, feminine rights, reproductive rights, pro-LGBTQ rights, and so on. And yet because you've apparently chosen the wrong theory, I guess, the biological basis of gender, sex and gender, all the other criteria, all the other boxes that you check are not enough to override that one particular, I guess, ideology or belief or theory that they don't want to be true.
I have to say thank you for defending me on social media. And did you happen to see one person, because you said something like she's a woman, she's a minority, and someone had tweeted at you, she's not a minority, she's Asian, which I thought was really funny.
That is funny. Yeah, I guess
Sad
globally
and really funny.
Are Asians minorities? How many billions of Asians? Yeah, now in America. Yeah, that is a weird thing.
I think it also feeds into this larger idea that because Asians don't fit the stereotype of what an oppressed group is supposed to look like, we're considered white now.
I see. You have a kind of white privilege. It's an Asian privilege or something.
We have white privilege.
Yeah, so all this business about power and stuff like that. Well, the point is, though, if you tie your science to your ideology and you think that the science has to come out a certain way or else people aren't going to have rights or whatever, this is a recipe for disaster because it'll corrupt the science for sure.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've been talking to a number of people doing press for this book, and they ask me, for people who are skeptical of science, how can we trust scientists? How can we trust papers coming out now that they're going to be unbiased? And I actually really wasn't sure what to tell them, because I was saying, yes, a lot of the research that is coming out now is based in activist thinking, and papers that go against those narratives get pulled, and I think good researchers see what happens to researchers who try to publish papers that go against social justice doctrines. And they think, well, I don't want to get mobbed. I don't want my loved ones being attacked. Right. I don't want my reputation ruined. I don't want my work being suppressed. I don't want to be deplatformed. So all these things. And as an academics work so hard, and it just, you shouldn't have to be dealing with that stuff. So I understand. I just, it's really sad where we are right now.
When we say they are attacking, who is the they, and how many of them are there? Is it just a tiny minority, but they have a loud, big platform?
I would say so. I mean, it's hard to know the exact number, but my sense is they definitely don't represent most people definitely not in terms of scientists. But I do think the next generation of scientists that are coming up are more indoctrinated in this way of thinking, because we do see how these ideas are starting to gain more attention and more momentum. And especially within sex research, I see my colleagues who are more focused on the quality of the work as opposed to its political reach, and who it makes potentially happy with its message. Those people are going to be retiring soon. So I am quite concerned about where we're going to be going when it comes to research around sex and gender in particular. Yeah,
we'll get to that in a minute because your last chapter is on the future. But you mentioned, I think in the first chapter, that that when you give these talks at conferences and you're attacked publicly, but privately you get far more messages of people saying, thank God you said that, or I agree with you, but I can't say anything publicly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think also what you see on social media is not reflective of what most people in the general public think or how they view these particular views. Something like the fact that I call into question the mantra, trans women are women. I mean, I fully support trans rights. I believe trans people deserve legal protections. They deserve support and love. But I think when you look at it from a biological, I mean, we can't even talk about biology in the context of people who are trans because that's seen as transphobic. But I do think there are some differences between individuals who are born female and trans women. And I don't think it should be transphobic to point that out, because those differences do have implications in terms of also the well-being of trans people. And I think also to deny those realities hurts the trans activist movement, because most people will say, well, what you're saying is not factually accurate.
Yeah, the kind of thing you said at the beginning of your book, I thought should have just needed to be said once. That is, I'm pro-trans rights, but now we're going to talk about science, and we've gotten that out of the way. But you had to say it like every chapter, just because people can't seem to get that.
Well, I also have visions of people taking screenshots or taking photos of certain paragraphs, taking them out of context and putting them on social media and saying, see, she said X, Y, Z. So I really ask anyone, listening to don't trust what people say that I say. Actually go and read the book and see what I say, because I do find people will I don't know whether it's intentional or not, they will misrepresent a lot of what I've said in the past in terms of my writing or things I say in appearances. And I'm perfectly happy to engage with someone who disagrees with me, but I would like it to be a good faith conversation or a disagreement as opposed to people creating, straw man attacks.
Yeah. One last point on that I wanted to get your opinion on. The Bill C-16 in Canada that Jordan Peterson put on the map as a controversial thing about personal pronouns and whether corporations and governmental agencies and other organizations should be forced to call people what they want, or if this is just a personal choice. Now, you've made it clear that you'll call a person who asks you whatever they want to be called. Me too. But that's a different question, as Jordan pointed out, of making it a law that you have to call somebody this, or else you are discriminating against them and you could be prosecuted or fined or whatever. What are your thoughts on that?
In general, I don't like the government telling people what kind of speech they should use or can use, especially with regards to that particular law. I do find it quite invasive. And because a lot of what's coming, even into Canadian law now, I mean, there's one bill that is trying to be passed that actually says that it is illegal to conduct conversion therapy for gender identity. And so anyone who does practice this can face up to 5 years in prison. So we can talk a bit about that, because that's completely, the idea that there is quote unquote conversion therapy for gender identity is unscientific, because it does not exist. Conversion therapy for sexual orientation, I don't support, because it doesn't work, because as I mentioned, sexual orientation is biological.
This is different than transitioning.
But I just don't think
this is different than transitioning.
So what people call conversion therapy for gender identity is if you have a child, say, who feels that they are more like the opposite sex and they would like to transition. If a mental health practitioner sits down and says, what else is going on in your life, tries to understand if there's another path forward for the child instead of transitioning, that's considered conversion therapy. So that gets lumped in with conversion therapy bans. And that's been banned in something like 20 states in the U.S.
Really?
But it's not the same thing. Conversion therapy for gender identity is not the same as conversion therapy for sexual orientation, because most children who feel that they identify more as the opposite sex are likely to grow up to be comfortable in their birth sex. They're more likely to be gay in adulthood.
Yeah, okay, let's get into the science of this here. You make it clear right from the beginning there's a difference between sex and gender. Just walk us through these basic nomenclature of the science, so those of us who are not accustomed to these terms can know what you're talking about here.
Sure. So biological sex is determined by gametes, so that's either sperm or eggs. Gender refers to gender identity, so how we feel in relation to our biological sex, whether we feel masculine or feminine. And then gender expression is the expression of our gender identity through our appearance, mannerisms, our behavior. So most men will be masculine and most women will be feminine. And gender dysphoria is the feeling that one identifies more as the opposite sex than their birth sex.
Right. Okay. So that's super clear. So it's not what you have between your legs. It's not the bits and parts. It's do you make sperm or do you make eggs? To that extent, there's only two. So I can say all I want. I identify as a woman and I can menstruate. No, I can't. I can't make eggs. I can't menstruate. That's it, period. Now, this other thing where I say I like to dress up in women's clothes or whatever, that you're talking about something else there.
Right. So it depends. When you say dress up in women's clothes, I guess there's a difference between a trans woman, say, and someone who is a cross-dresser. Right. So cross-dressing is usually men who wear women's clothing or accessories or makeup because they find it sexually arousing. For trans women, that is not necessarily the case, but it's definitely not considered respectful to refer to trans women as cross-dressers, as I'm sure you know. But in terms of with regard to, say, biological sex, most trans people the definition of transgender is changing now, where trans used to mean someone identifies as the opposite sex and they're pursuing potentially not necessarily, but usually medical interventions to facilitate living as the opposite sex. But now the term transgender has expanded to also include people who feel that they are a third gender, and they may or may not pursue medical transitioning. Sometimes they will just basically change their haircut and wear different clothes. And then also it has been expanded to include people who are just gender nonconforming. So someone who, like me, I'm a woman, but I prefer men's clothing, something like that. And I think the reason for that is in an attempt to increase the prevalence of people who identify, quote unquote, as transgender, to facilitate acceptance. But again, I don't think we need to inflate the number in order to facilitate acceptance for people who are different. And in fact, within the trans community, many people say to me, those who have medically transitioned to live as a binary gender, but to live as the opposite sex, they feel they have very little in common with people who want to live as a third gender, or who say that their gender fluctuates from when they wake up till they go to sleep. The concept of gender fluidity, which is also not scientific.
Right. And here it gets even more complicated when you talk about the distinction between who I identify as, or what I identify as, and who I'm attracted to. That can complicate the formula.
Right. So with regard to gender identity and sexual orientation, they are distinct, but they're also related. There's a myth now, and I talk about that in the book, that they are completely unrelated things, and that you can't tell one thing about a person based on one point versus another. For most people who are gay, they're more likely to be gender atypical. So gay men tend to be more feminine on average, and lesbian women tend to be more masculine on average. And then also sexual orientation plays a role in terms of the conversation around transitioning and reasons for transitioning.
Right. I remember reading a piece by Andrew Sullivan, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, when this was all coming out in the public conversation. And, he's a gay guy. And his comment was something like, if you're a young teenage boy and you're attracted to boys and you think you might be a boy trapped in a girl's body, so maybe you should transition. No, dude, you're just a gay guy. Just own it. It's okay. We've made a lot of progress here. We don't have to complicate it with all these other possible options. And that was revealing to me because I hadn't really thought about it like that. And you make that point in the book that, that in that early age, say age 10 to 15 or maybe 13 to 18, something like that, when kids are trying to figure out who they are and who they're attracted to and so on, that could get confusing if you throw in this, you may not be a gay guy, you might be something else.
Yeah, I do think that is potentially a reason why also parents are going along with allowing their children to transition, because if you have a very feminine son, I think some parents can sense that there's a chance that little boy is going to grow up to be gay. But if he transitions to female, when she grows up, she's going to appear to be a straight woman who's attracted to men. But the strange thing is now, too, with the way this whole ideology is the direction it's moving in, with the, say, non-binary movement, I see that comprising of individuals who are either gay or lesbian, but who may not feel comfortable identifying that way because there is homophobia in society. I grew up in the gay community, and I saw a lot of the discrimination that my friends would face, and I think gay people still to some extent face today. And it's, I think, easier to live as this other gender, whereas now you're praised if you come out as non-binary versus if you are gay or lesbian, you face the same forms of discrimination that's been around for ages.
Yeah. Where did you grow up? Where was this? Oh,
Toronto.
In Toronto, yeah. Well, yeah, it's probably good to remember how recent all this was. In 2011, both Hillary and Obama came out against gay marriage, and it wasn't really until after that 2012 election campaign that they both came out in favor of gay marriage. And then 2015 is when the Supreme Court decision here in the United States was made. So that's pretty recent that progress has been made. And I've noticed that the religious right and Christian conservatives have kind of quietly dropped the subject, which is kind of what I predicted years ago, that, they're sort of maybe 10 years behind the cultural trends on civil liberties and women's rights and so on. And instead of conceding defeat, they just quietly go away. And then later they come back and take credit for it. Like they did this with the abolition of slavery. It's like, those Episcopalians and the Quakers, those are our people. It's like, yeah, they were early, champions of the abolition of slavery, but their main opponents were Christians, making these arguments from the Bible of why slavery was perfectly okay. So, and so again, the Episcopalians, they were in favor of gay marriage, I think in the early 90s. So they were way ahead of the curve. So I'm predicting that the religious right will say, see, that was our idea, that gay rights thing. We championed that. I don't know how they're going to fall on this next one.
But that's the thing. The crazy thing is now I see it. It's fully homophobia. And why are we not calling it out for what it is and saying, you don't need to be a third gender. Let's fight the discrimination that you face as a gay person. But we're not saying that. No one's talking about that. No one's having a conversation about what this non-binary movement really is about.
Yeah. Now let's tell us what we know about the numbers, percentages, raw numbers, whatever. How many? What's the latest estimate of percentage of gay and lesbians, and then what percentage of trans people and so forth?
Gay and lesbian, so the statistic varies. I mean, I think it's approximately 2% right now. That's the common statistic. With regard to non-binary, approximately 10% of millennials identify as a third gender.
10%?
And that goes down, which is a lot of people. It's a lot of people. And I would be all for trying on different identities and seeing what works for you and working through whatever discomfort you might have in your gender. Because I do think people who identify this way do deserve compassion, because in many cases they are struggling with something. But with this movement in particular comes certain things like medical interventions like double mastectomies. And you see this in young women as young as age 12 getting these surgeries done, which is, I don't believe a 12-year-old has the cognitive capacity to understand the ramifications of something like that. So it really worries me.
Is that true? Really, 12-year-olds have had these surgeries?
Yep. There have been medical conferences. There have been medical conferences where they talk about this.
Are they at least required to have parental signing off on this?
Right, because age of medical consent is usually considered 16, so that you're not supposed to start hormones until that age. But it depends on the state, because some states it's younger than that. And then top surgery is not supposed to be until a year after you've been on testosterone. But if you have parents and other medical professionals who are willing to sign off on it, you can get it at a younger age.
Here's a question I wrote down while listening to your book. If you're transitioning to a different gender, but the word gender is largely meaningless biologically, then what are you transitioning to, and what's the point of hormone therapy and surgery if biology has nothing to do with it?
That's a question you're going to have to ask gender activists, because that's exactly it. It absolutely does not make any sense. There's no logic.
Right. I mean, to me, that seems like a QED. You lost the argument. You're defeating your own argument by saying, I'm going to start taking hormone. But biology has nothing to do with it. But I'm going to start taking these hormones. Well, you just said that the hormones make a difference.
Right. I've heard some people say, some trans activists will say that gender is a social construct, because that to me seems to invalidate the idea that you have, because the common narrative is that someone who's transgender has the opposite brain sex in their body. And so to me, if you say gender is a social construct, doesn't that conflict with that? But their understanding is that your idea of what constitutes male or female is based in gender stereotypes. So if you are a trans woman, you have learned what the stereotypes are associated with being female. And so that's why you feel the way that you do.
Yeah, I mean, I can see their point on how stereotypes about women, in particular, throughout history until really just very recently, were pretty injurious to women. Another one of my binge-watching episodes was the 10-hour series on Einstein, and the way his first wife, Mileva, was treated. I mean, she was probably pretty close to the genius that he was. Maybe nobody is an Einstein, but anyway, she was way up there and probably made some contributions to the special theory of relativity, but no one would take her seriously. And her own father didn't think she could make it in the Prussian Academy of Sciences, and then she finally makes it, through this other school, and then marries Einstein, and he kind of expects her to just take care of the house and take care of him, and not really do science with him. And this is all she wanted, and but it was pretty pervasive. And this is well into the 20th century that these attitudes continued. It was really hard. I mean, there's a scene where Marie and Pierre and Marie Curie are working, and then his assistant comes in and announces to him, "Hey, the Nobel Prize has just awarded you the prize." And he said, "Me? Yeah, just you." He's like, "I won't accept it because Marie did just as much, if not more work than I did." And then they cut to Einstein going, I deserve the prize and, and just me. And it's like, oh boy. And so I think Einstein was more of the sort of the normal attitude at the time. So you kind of see why this kind of pushback against what you're saying comes from the history.
Oh, I definitely get it. And I think so in 2017, when James Damore wrote his infamous Google memo that went viral and people got very upset, and I wrote a column defending his memo for the Globe and Mail. And, I coming from an academic background, I've always been very strident about facts and defending the science because I see how hard it is for my colleagues to get funding and to have their work taken seriously. And I found it very offensive that people were coming in, often these are people who are not experts in the field, saying, oh, that scientific research is outdated, it's sexist, it's not valid. Since then, I try to listen to feedback and see what critics of mine have to say. And I do understand why people find any sort of research suggesting that there are biologically based differences between men and women, why they find that so threatening. I still am going to say that the research is legitimate, but I do understand why it's such a touchy subject for some people. And I am sympathetic to that.
Yeah, no, let's be clear on the James Damore memo, as well as Larry Summers' comments when he was president of Harvard. No one was saying that there's fewer women in STEM because they don't have the ability. It was just how many of them are interested in those topics, right? That is to say,
exactly.
as
and
a career,
I think,
profession.
Right. And I think so long as women and men are free to do what they want in society, if we have a discrepancy in the sex ratio in something like STEM disciplines, that shouldn't be viewed as a problem. I have my PhD in a STEM discipline, and I won't say that, of course, sexism does exist, but for women in North America, if you want to pursue something and you want to succeed, you can do it. It's not something that's going to hold you back.
Yeah, I think most of these tech companies, and I know most universities like Caltech and MIT are dying to have more women if they can find them. Just, they're open to it. The barriers have largely lowered now and should be, or at least close in most places, equal opportunity.
Right. What I don't like is when some institutions choose to intentionally give young women or women just in general extra points on their their admission test scores. I find that really patronizing. And I also don't think that helps women because for those individuals, if they do choose to go into these programs, if their male peers know that they are there because they got extra points on their tests, how does that help fight the stereotype that women are not as competent?
Right.
I don't think they'll be as welcome in those programs. I think that actually creates a more hostile environment for them.
Yeah, Shelby Steele made that point back in the late 80s in his book, Content of Our Character, about affirmative action. He was worried about blacks getting hired into major corporations and the whites going, oh, well, he didn't really qualify for this great job. Sort of a backfire effect.
Well, I mean, we see with affirmative action, too, how Asians are actually being penalized now for doing well, which I think is also very unfair. And I think, I don't think there's any, as an Asian woman, I don't think there's anything inherent about being Asian that leads us to be more successful. I think we work hard and we place an emphasis on education. Not all Asians, of course, because then there are some people who get mad at me and say, you don't speak for all Asians. I'm not trying to speak for the entire race. I'm just saying, on average, to explain these differences in terms of what I see. And I don't think it's fair to be penalizing groups that are doing well in the name of helping others. I think we should help groups that are not doing as well, but not at the cost of those that are doing well.
I loved your comments in the book about programming. Why are we holding this up as this, magnificent job that everybody wants? That's a hard job, and hardly anybody really wants that job.
And the thing is, anyone who has spent a decent amount of time programming is not going to tell you that it's glamorous and fun. It's a lot of sitting, staring at the computer, not talking to people. Usually you're there till late, like super early in the morning and you're exhausted. And that's not, for a lot of people, an ideal situation. That's not something someone wants to do every single day, day in or day out. And I don't know why it's considered sexist to say that.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about this when I was in my 20s, like, what do I want to do? And, looking at different professions, lawyers and doctors and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and this sort of thing. And it's like, yeah, they're successful and they make a lot of money, but this is not the life I want. I mean, they work like 60, 80 hours a week. They, don't have much of a family life. They don't spend as much time with their kids. They don't have leisure time. I've been a cyclist my whole life. I need an hour or two at least a day to get outdoors. And, that kind of life, who wants to work 60, 80 hours? Even if you make 10 million a year as a CEO of some Fortune 500 company, to me, is not worth it. So, that maybe slightly more women on average than men choose a more balanced lifestyle where they're home more with their kids. To me, that's the better choice. And I think that's the choice more people make. The fact that maybe slightly more men make the choice to go the opposite direction than women is just an indication of, I don't know, temperament, preference, or something like that. It has nothing to do with abilities. Women can run Fortune 500 companies. We know they can. They can run countries like Angela Merkel of Germany. She's one of the great leaders that country's ever had. But, again, that's not a job many people want.
And that's the thing. We're not having that conversation. And I think it would actually benefit women. It would be more helpful to tell women that, if you do want to be focused on your career, there's going to be a hit to your personal life. And if you do want to have a family, you're going to have to think about how's that going to weigh in, because it's going to affect you in a different way than it's going to affect a man. But instead of that, we're telling women, no, it's due to sexism in the field, and it's due to people not wanting to hire women or give them fair opportunities. And so I don't find that helpful. I don't think that helps women make informed decisions in terms of what they should prioritize in life and what they should strive for.
All right, let's hit some of the other major points in your book. Gender dysphoria. This is one of another new topic that's just kind of hit the media in the last year or so. What is it, and what's going on with transitioning out of it or treating it medically or whatever?
So gender dysphoria is the feeling that an individual identifies more as the opposite sex than their birth sex. And it's especially contentious around the issue of childhood transitioning, because the common narrative is that the younger a child transitions, the better. And usually that will involve also potentially medical interventions. So the thing is, the way it's promoted by, say, parents and medical professionals is that you're allowing a child to try on a different identity. And if they change their mind, then they'll be able to go back to living as their birth sex, and there's no harm done there. But the thing is, a social transition, so that usually consists of a child taking on a new name. They're identifying as the opposite sex. They will usually start dressing as the opposite sex. Basically, everyone in the child's life treats them as though they are the opposite sex. It's not the same as having a child and saying, do whatever you want, dress however you want, but you are still the sex you're born as. And so the result of that is this child, research has shown that for children who socially transition, they are more likely to go on to undergo medical interventions. Their gender dysphoria is more likely to persist instead of desist. So desistance is, as I mentioned, the fact that the majority of kids who feel this way outgrow those feelings with time.
Interesting. So this is different than, say, like I have an adult daughter now, but when I was raising her, I introduced her to a lot of different sports. And just let her pick the one, whatever she wants to do. I didn't want to impose my love of cycling on her. Try soccer and dance and this and that, whatever. And but of course, there's no long term effects of that. You play soccer for a couple of years, then you do dance for a couple of years, then you do whatever you do. This is different than that.
Right. Well, exactly. I think that's fantastic. I think parents should, and I say in the book, I think parents should allow their kids to pursue a range of activities and see what they like, and let it be based on the child's preference as opposed to their sex. I do feel there's a push now, especially among progressive parents, that to really encourage gender atypicalness in their kids, as opposed to in the past. I think there was a sentiment that if you allow for children to be gender typical, and if you allowed a child to play with, say, gender atypical toys, that runs the risk of your child being gay. That was a common idea,
right.
Which, again, there's nothing wrong with being gay. Now it's almost in the complete opposite direction of saying you want a child that's gender atypical because that's going to mean they're going to have greater opportunities when they're an adult. But I think both are just as invasive. I think just, again, give your kids lots of options, love them, whichever direction they go in. But with these children in particular, it's just not appropriate because children say all kinds of things, and a lot of the times when kids say that they are the opposite sex, usually what they mean is they want to do things that the opposite sex does, and they just don't have the language for that. And it's just beyond me that adults are actually taking what young children are saying at face value.
Yeah, but my larger point was that trying on different genders is not like trying different sports. There are other consequences that trying different sports doesn't have that, say, trying on different genders does have. Well, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah.
Yeah. So, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So on gender neutral parenting, I love that chapter because, again, I have an adult daughter and now I have a 4-year-old son. So, and, the differences are just as stark as you make them out to be in the book. But just for fun, my wife and I, Jennifer, we bought this doll. I mean, he loves trucks, cars, airplane, anything with wheels and motors that's metal and moves and bangs. And this is what he loves. So we got him a doll and we would just put the doll in there with all the other stuff. He totally ignored it. I mean, he just wouldn't go. So then we would push it toward him and he'd kind of move around it. And then finally we'd put it right in front of him and he just takes the thing, boom. And it's just 3 seconds and it's gone. And it's not like I'm trying to force it on him. It was almost kind of a little joke, but it's just so obvious what the difference is. How could you not see that? And I would feel immoral if I pushed that on him. No, you have to play with dolls for an hour today. He would just be tormented. He would hate it, and then I'd feel bad.
And the funny thing is, I hear from parents with daughters who will say, we try gender neutral parenting. We try to encourage playing with things like building blocks instead of dolls, or giving our daughters gender atypical toys like trucks. But she wants a doll. She goes to school and she sees her friends have dolls and she comes home and she wants a doll. And I think most parents that are not ideological will say, okay, well, that it is what it is. We'll get you a doll. But the ones who are really steeped in this way of thinking will feel like they failed at gender neutral parenting. They don't realize that gender is not something you can mold in a child. And some of them get very upset. And I find every year around the holiday season, there are a bunch of op-eds that will come out and you have these parents who write about how horrible it is that there are gender toys and how we have to be rid of them, and how, their poor daughter wants to play with dolls and this is so horrible, and, she's going to be oppressed. And I feel really bad for those kids. They should just be free to do what they want.
And, if you say, well, Shermer, your home is rigged to be male, whatever, and the subtle cues, and I've had a behavioral Skinnerian program with my kid, and I don't even know I'm doing it. Okay. But when I take him to Target, and there's the whole toy section, it's huge. And he just runs over there. I just let him go wherever he wants. And sometimes I'll make him go up and down a couple of the aisles. He knows exactly what he's looking for. He just blows past the girl stuff, the dolls and what. And in Target, they've kind of reconfigured it so it doesn't look so girly or whatever. It doesn't matter. I mean, he knows what he's looking for, and he zeroes right in on it. So I don't push him at anything. He just does what he wants to do, and that's where he goes. So what's wrong with that?
Nothing's wrong with that.
Right.
And I was going to say, for people who say maybe you've set up your environment to be biased, what was your daughter like growing up?
Well, same kind of thing. She was very female, and well, at the time, Beanie Babies were popular, and of course Harry Potter. And I'm just trying to remember. I mean, I didn't force trucks on her or anything like that. She had zero interest in cars and trucks, and I don't know. I had one train set for Christmas that we would set up that she was not really that into. I don't know. It just seems pretty starkly obvious to me, and that if you don't force them, you just let them pick whatever they want. That just seems like the kind of the moral thing to do, and let the differences be whatever they are. I think
right, and I feel. Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say also, I feel this push, this undercurrent of sexism in that for parents who do subscribe to gender neutral parenting, more often it's a push to have their daughters be more male typical. Like there's this trend of gender neutral names, and girls are constantly being given more masculine sounding names, or at least less feminine sounding names, because they're hoping that that's going to help open up opportunities for their daughters. And we're not fighting the underlying sexism there that's saying, yes, men and women are on average different. That doesn't mean that we're totally different. That doesn't mean that says anything about any individual person. And that also doesn't mean that one is better than the other. And so at the same time, pushing girls and women to be more like men, to me, is more sexist.
Yeah.
I don't see why women and girls can't be respected in their own right.
Yeah, that's right. Well, yeah. So in school, I encouraged my daughter to just try out lots of different subjects. And by the time she got to college, I encouraged her to take a whole variety of classes, math and engineering, geology, to psychology and whatever, anything, the whole range, just whatever you're interested in. Don't do what I think you should do. And she did anyway. So I don't know what else I could do besides that. I mean, part of the problem is there's this idea that if you have a single problem right here, that's a synecdoche or a kind of a representation of a larger, deeper root cause in systemic misogyny or racism in society. It's like with the BLM movement now with George Floyd and the cop that that killed him. So the problem isn't that all cops are racist or that policing is systematically biased and racist. There may be some of that, but the problem is that guy right there, the guy that killed him. That's the guy. We got to do something about him. Or there's 3 of them in this police department, or there's 6 of them in that police department. That's the problem to solve. But the way the human mind is designed by evolution is to take a few anecdotes or examples and then generalize. And really, this is what science does. We want to generalize to some theory, some underlying, overarching explanation for all the variety we look at. I mean, this is what the theory of evolution is all about, and most of psychology is trying to do this. Most psych papers have some hypothesis they're testing or some overarching theory, and that's fine, that's good. But part of the problem with that is then you take maybe this 0.01 or 1% or whatever it is, and say, well, so there's some issues with that, so we have to generalize to this larger, and we got to call it something. So you also write about, kinky.
You have to give it good branding.
Yeah, good branding, right. So you talk about kinky sex, for example, and why do we have to call it something? Why does it have to have a label? What is you talked about autogynophilia. Maybe tell us what that is. But why does it have to have this big arching? Why not just say, that person right there likes these 3 things here, end of story?
Okay, so let's start by defining autogynophilia. So autogynophilia is a Greek word that means love of oneself as a woman. And I should preface this by saying this issue is very, very controversial. This is the reason why so many sex researchers and experts refuse to counter any sort of aspect of trans ideology because of the history that is there between trans activists and sex researchers, where trans activists who do not like what sex researchers have to say will go after them and really try to ruin them professionally and in their personal lives. So autogynophilia is the work of my colleague and mentor, Ray Blanchard, and it refers to the fact that for some trans women, they are their motivation for transitioning is due to the fact that they find the idea of being a woman sexually arousing. And I want to really emphasize, I don't want this information to be used to hold back trans people. I also don't want it to be used to justify negative stereotypes about trans women. And I do also think that individuals who experience autogynophilia should be allowed to transition if they are adults and they decide that's what's right for them. But this is a key piece of the conversation that's been missing. But I have so many people who reach out to me. The reason I chose to write about this in the book is because so many people have reached out to me over the years saying, I experienced this. I don't know what it is. They don't have a word for it or name for it, but they're trying to understand themselves. And so I felt it was important to write about it. And even in the time since this book has come out and since I've been doing appearances talking about it, so many people have reached out to me saying, that is me. And thank you for saying that, because now at least I know and I can go look this up and I can, read more about it. The thing is, if you do look up the term autogynophilia, a lot of what you're going to find is people saying that this is quote unquote outdated medical research. This is junk science. This is made up by sex researchers to try and invalidate transgender people. That's not true. Everyone, I would say, in the field who knows about the scientific literature knows that autogynophilia exists and is real and is empirically valid, but they're just terrified to say that. And that includes clinicians who work with patients with gender dysphoria, including adults with gender dysphoria. So I felt, again, I have to be honest. That's just how I am with my work. And where did we want to go from that? You were asking me something else.
Well, I was talking about
trying to remember what that was.
I was talking about a larger issue and sort of philosophy of science and how it works. If from a behavioral Skinnerian perspective, there's just behavior that we observe, and different people do different things. But in cognitive psych and just in science in general, we want something broader. We want to say that, this 2% of people here represent this label. And the moment you put a label on it and then you define it a certain way, then you have to decide, well, are you in that bin or are you not in that bin? And maybe the bin has kind of fuzzy boundaries where people can kind of slide in and out, or they don't quite fit the characteristics of what's defined in that box or how that box is defined. And this is, I think, a limitation of our cognition. We want to do this because we want to generalize. We can't absorb every single detail about the world, so we have to pigeonhole things and put them in different categories. And unfortunately, that leads to prejudice and stereotyping. But on the other hand, it's kind of a cognitive heuristic to shortcut our thinking into making decisions about things because, rapid decision making, because you can't process all that information. So I was thinking about that reading your book. It's like we kind of do that. We kind of have to do that, pigeonhole people and put them in different boxes. But there's a risk to doing that.
Right. I think also coming from the perspective of a clinician, so I don't do clinical work anymore, but if you're trying to determine what is the best outcome for someone or what are they're presenting with certain symptoms and trying to understand, best treatment practice, something like autogynophilia, it's categorized as a paraphilia, which is an unusual sexual preference, which was my area of expertise when I was in academia. So when you understand that it's a paraphilia and that this is something then that also is likely not going to change over the course of someone's life, and you also know that this is their primary sexual preference. So then that helps you understand, okay, for someone who comes in to talk to you about this, what's the path forward for them and how can you better understand this? But I understand what you're saying in terms of it. I think it's also important not to stereotype, not to assume that just because someone fits a particular diagnostic category, that is who they are, or that you should make assumptions about them and that they shouldn't be treated as an individual.
We almost can't help but doing it, though. The moment you put somebody in a bin and you have a sense of what people in that bin are like, then they have to be like those other people. Of course, they may not be. I was thinking about this listening to your conversation with Joe Rogan yesterday. You guys got talking about pornography. Is it addictive? And you were saying the research is mixed. That's true. It is very mixed. We did an issue of Skeptic on it, and I had two opposing positions on this. But it really very much turns on, what do you mean by addicted? What is an addiction? That is a very fuzzy concept that varies in different areas, like alcohol or drugs or gambling or whatever. And that's what I'm talking about here. This is one of those fuzzy sets that makes me uncomfortable, because the moment you call it something like it's an addiction, so that puts it in the disease model framework. Like, okay, we have to treat this. Why? Okay, porn by itself, we know what that is. But to what extent, as you were pointing out, does it interfere with your job, your relationship with your significant other, your kids, whatever? That's the only thing that matters. You, particularly, not the word addiction or the people that are in that bin, but do you personally have a problem because you're doing X, whatever, drinking or porn or whatever, gambling, and does it interfere with your life? That's really the only thing that matters.
Right. I'm not sure that I would say the research is mixed. I would say the research is in favor of the idea that pornography, so-called addiction, is not an addiction. It has to do usually with psychological comorbidity like anxiety, depression. As I mentioned when I was on Joe Rogan's podcast, procrastination. For the research studies that have suggested that it's more like an addiction, it's important to look at the actual methods, as I'm sure you would, and see if, in some cases, the individuals who are considered to be quote unquote addicted to pornography will look at it as often as maybe once a week. To them, they consider themselves to be addicted. But I think to the average person, I used to do research on hypersexuality. That was actually one of my dissertation topics. And I would talk to men who spend 8-12 hours a day watching pornography and masturbating. To me, that's not an addiction. That's definitely excessive. And I don't deny that excessive porn viewing exists. But I think for some people who use the term pornography addiction to describe themselves, it's important to determine, is this even a problem in their life? Why is it they view it a problem? Because some people just feel guilty or shameful about viewing pornography, period. And I think there's a time and place for porn. I think some of it can be degrading to women. I don't think all of it is necessarily that way. And some people say, well, of course, she says that. She used to be a columnist for this magazine. But these are my views. You can go back as far as I've been doing sex research. Even before I was writing for men's magazines, this was my perspective. So, if the research literature showed us something different, I would be on board with that. But as it stands, that's where we are. Yeah, my author for the critical piece was Phil Zimbardo and one of his colleagues, I think graduate student maybe, who were arguing that, you know these arguments, that young boys watching porn think, well, this is what women want, so I'm going to do this if I have a relationship. Or worse,
having a relationship with an actual person is complicated and it's stressful and anxiety producing. I can just get off, and there's no stress of having to actually interact with somebody on porn. That was kind of the argument. Like, it's leading young men. I think they actually did a book on this. I forget the title now, but in any case, that's what they were worried about. Not addiction so much as a distortion of the reality of what a relationship with a woman for a young man growing up should really be like.
Right. I don't disagree with that. I don't think it's appropriate for children to be looking at pornography, and I definitely don't think they should be using it as a learning tool in terms of what to expect, in terms of what real life sex is going to be like. Because pornography is entertainment. It's essentially a highlight reel in terms of sexual intercourse. It's not how you shouldn't expect that to be how you're going to interact with a real life partner. So that's something that definitely children should be aware of, because they are being exposed to this at increasingly young ages. And I think for a lot of them, it's very confusing and potentially upsetting because they don't know that that's not real.
Right. Okay, trans bathrooms, trans in the military, and so on. What's your position on all that?
Okay, so let's start with, I would say the most contentious issue for me is in terms of prison. I don't think I'm someone who has worked previously with sex offenders, both in a research and clinical capacity. It's not appropriate to be putting male sex offenders, so someone who is found to have committed a sexual offense against, say, a female victim, if that individual says that they identify as female, they will be recorded by the police as female, and then they will be, if convicted, they will be placed into a women's prison. To me, that's completely inappropriate, because anyone who works with sex offenders knows that sex offenders lie about pretty much everything. And I don't doubt that there are maybe some sex offenders who experience gender dysphoria while they're in prison, because you'll see this. They will go into a men's prison, and then they'll say, oh, I identify as female now, and they will need to be transferred to a women's prison. And there have been cases where this happens, and then the offender goes on to, surprise, surprise, offend against more women while in prison. So I think it should be done on regardless of the context with these issues of whether it's appropriate for trans women to be in women's spaces. I think it should really be on an individual basis, especially with prison. And that's the job of the psychologist, to sit down and do an assessment in terms of, does this person have genuine gender dysphoria? Are they malingering? And also, what is their likelihood for reoffending?
Yeah. So does it vary by state on what prisons are required to do or not?
In terms of assessments?
Yeah, and where they put, so if a guy says, I identify as a woman, now put me in the women's prison, do they have to do that? Or is it a case-by-case basis?
This is happening more in the UK right now. I think in terms of the US, I don't think it's as much of a problem for you guys yet. But in the UK, there have been some cases. We've had some cases in Canada of, say, women's shelters, where we have individuals who are born male who will say they identify as female, and then they are in a women's shelter, and then they'll abuse the women who are there. So something like shelters, I think, are similarly very sensitive in that way, that we need to be able to talk about this openly, because there is a higher risk there, especially for the women who are there. They usually will have a history of sexual trauma. Some of them have substance use problems. If they're going to be sleeping next to potentially a stranger, and they're very vulnerable when they're asleep, you don't want them to be re-traumatized, especially if there's someone who is preoperative. But something like bathrooms, for me, I don't personally have as much of an issue if trans women want to use women's bathrooms. But I also don't think it's okay to tell women and girls who are concerned about this that they don't matter and that they're hateful for having concerns about it.
Is there a reason to be concerned? Are there trans guys that are transitioning to women, going into women's bathrooms and harassing women, or being peeping toms or anything like that? Do we know about that as an issue?
I wouldn't say the issue is trans women doing things like that. I think trans women do face unfair stereotypes and stigma about being the types of people to do that, when that's not true. The issue is when you have antisocial men who are not trans taking advantage of these policies. Right. And we do see, say in the UK, it was in their swimming pools, there was a study that was done, and they showed that 90% of complaints about sexual harassment and assault were in unisex spaces.
Wow. Okay. Right. I had prisoners write me occasionally.
It's a lot, Michael.
No, it's not. I get a lot of letters from prisoners because what else have they got to do? And they usually just want free stuff, free copies of Skeptic magazine or whatever. But occasionally they write me about what they're really up to. I had one guy who was on death row in New England, in Boston. And he had raped and killed several women. So, he deserves to die or whatever your position is. He deserved to be in prison for life for sure. Anyway, he was writing me about, being against the death penalty, but he made it clear, don't ever let me out because no matter what, how you treat me or whatever, I just can't help myself. I just feel like when I see a woman on the street, I just want to rape her. That's what I want to do. He goes, in fact, after I was convicted, I'm in the van, chained down to the van floor and guards, and I'm being driven to the max security prison, and I see a woman on the sidewalk, and all I could think about was, how can I get out of this van to attack this woman? I thought, holy crap. There are some people that are just really bad who shouldn't be let out. This is a little kind of tangential to what you were talking about, but there is obviously some, pretty hard wiring in his brain there. Okay,
that's probably, he probably has a paraphilia called coercive paraphilia. So this is actually a sexual preference for non-consensual sex.
Right.
And
Okay.
as many as 60% of convicted rapists have this preference. So rape is not about power. Let's be clear.
Interesting. Okay.
It's about sex.
It's about sex. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
That's not to say it's okay.
Well,
I want to be clear.
Yes, it's amazing. We have to say this every 5 minutes. Of course, it's not okay. So it's not about any kind of sex. Like, I just want to get laid in any way I can. So here's one way to do it. It's like, I prefer that she resist. Is that what you're saying? They get off on that.
So for most men, yes, most men do not find non-consensual sex arousing. Most men, if they feel that their partner is resisting them or abhorring their advances, they will stop and say, she's not feeling this, I'm not going to continue. For men with coercive paraphilia, that's actually what they prefer, because many of these men actually do have spouses and girlfriends who would be happy to have sex with them consensually, but they will seek out partners who actually do not want to have sex with them as their victims.
What about the Bill Cosby case, or more general, people that like to date what is it? Date, rape, drug. No, that's not the right term. The rape drug, whatever that is. I forget what that is.
Right.
Why would you want to have sex with somebody who's unconscious? There must be a term for that, because I just find that really bizarre.
I'm trying to remember the exact facts of that case. I think somnophilia would speak to that. It's a preference for partners who are sleeping. There's probably some aspect of the control there. But again, it's about sex. It's not this larger overarching power that men supposedly have over women.
Right. But the standard feminist line on that is that it's about power, not sex. So how do you explain someone like a Harvey Weinstein or an Epstein or somebody like that uses their power to get sex?
Well,
or is it that
not all men?
Is it that they have?
Not all men with power do that.
Well, most
right?
of them don't.
And it's hard for me to say without sitting down across from someone like that and doing an assessment to see exactly what it is they find arousing about the things that they've done. But I would say for I'm thinking of those cases in particular. Well, Epstein is a bit different because those girls were younger too.
He seemed to have a window there of like 15 to 14 to 17, something like that. Yeah, I had another guy writing me who told me that he was in prison for kiddie porn. He had kiddie porn on his computer. And he told me that when he was 8, he suddenly found himself attracted to 8-year-old boys. But as he got older, his attractions were fixed at age 8. So when he's 10, he likes 8-year-old boys. When he's 15, he likes 8-year-old boys. And he got imprinted on that. And he was trying to tell me, this is normal. I mean, you're you're a straight guy, so you attracted to women, but I like 8-year-old boys. It's just the way it is. Like, dude, that's not, however you think you feel about it, it's not legal. And it's wrong. It hurts these. By the way, is it unquestionably clear that it is harmful to young boys, say, when Catholic priests abuse them?
I would say yes, because it's not consensual. So in that,
not morally.
with what you're saying with that individual,
morally, yes, that's right. It's wrong. but I mean psychologically. Because, there's this Mambly, man-boy love organization.
NAMBLA.
Yeah. That back in the days of Greeks and Romans, this was totally normal, and it wasn't harmful to the young boys. They had an older mentor who they had sex with, and it was okay because it's only harmful now because we say it's harmful, but it's not really harmful. Something like that.
No, I don't agree with that. I think it is harmful for children because children, again, do not have the cognitive capacity to consent to sex. And but what you were saying with that other individual, that's very common because I used to work with men with pedophilia, and they will find that they are attracted to their same aged peers when they're young, and as they get older, that preference doesn't change. Whereas they see their peers becoming attracted to people who are the same age. So, but yeah, I should be very clear. Pedophilia has been shown that it is something that is hardwired in the brain, but that does not say that sexual abuse against children is acceptable or that someone acting on that sexual proclivity should be excused in their behavior.
And is it kind of an imprinting thing? You're at a critical stage, and that whatever you're exposed to in your environment, that gets hardwired in? Do we know that?
From the research I worked on, it suggests that their brain development is slightly different. But we're still trying to figure that out because it is such a taboo subject. It's really difficult to get funding to do that research. And people get also very upset because they say, why are you trying to understand this? I think there's a sentiment that if we try to understand it from a research perspective, are we trying to normalize it? Are we trying to absolve individuals who, especially biological explanations, there's a fear, I think, to say, well, if this is biological, are you then saying that this is natural or that should be accepted? No, I am not saying that. I'm saying that from a prevention perspective, it's important to understand why individuals have these preferences because that's going to help us make society safer for children.
Right. Okay, let's talk transports. This is a super.
Oh, you're ready to go.
Well, I don't know if you know about my background as a bike racer, but in the 1980s, I co-founded the Race Across America, which is a 3,000-mile nonstop transcontinental race initially it was from LA to New York. There were just 4 of us that did it the first year. Then it got bigger and bigger, and we had major television coverage and corporate sponsors and money, prize money, and so on. Anyway, then in the 90s, I was the race director. So we entered, women started entering the race the second year. I mean, we were totally open to this. And in 93 and 94, I had 2 women who were better than most of the men, Shauna Hogan and Muffy Ritz. And they actually led the entire race. They were ahead of all the men all the way into Colorado, like 1,000 miles into the race. And this got a lot of media. It's like, oh my God, the women are just as good at men, maybe not in sprinting, but in long distance cycling, maybe something like that. And so then there was much talk like, why do we have a men's division and a women's division? Maybe we should just have one division and just divide up the prize money that way. So I thought, well, I'll just ask the affected parties, the 2 women, do you want to just be in the men's division? There's no division. And they go, hell no. Because, there's all these men out there, who knows, because we don't know enough. And they didn't want that. So I said, okay, I'm not going to do that. And anyway, they eventually got caught and they beat most of the men, but they were like second or third or fourth overall. Because there are certain strength and differences between men and women. So talk a little bit about that in your book, The Effects of Testosterone on Development. It's not just bigger muscles. It changes the whole body. This is why we have men's and divisions, men and women's divisions in most sports. Exactly.
And I think those female cyclists that you speak of are probably outliers to some extent, because if you do look at men and women on average, men are going to be faster and stronger. And it's not fair if you were to say, okay, well, for female competitors, they should just work harder and try to, keep up with men. So that's why I am critical of the idea of including trans women in women's sports, especially one sport that I particularly like, mixed martial arts. In this case, there's a very high likelihood that someone could potentially be really badly hurt and even killed in the event that someone who's born female is competing against a trans woman. And so even in the case of, say, where a trans woman is taking testosterone blockers and taking estrogen therapy, that actually strengthens her bones. So that makes up for the presumed bone loss that would come from being on anti-androgenic medication. So this is another issue that is super contentious. I understand why, because even in saying this to you and in writing that chapter, it feels insensitive to say that trans women are in any way different from women who are born women. It's almost as though we're telling them who they are or who they're allowed to be. And that's not my intention. My intention is to say, again, we have to look at this from a fact-based perspective, because there are implications if we ignore those facts.
Are there enough trans to have a trans division in some sports?
I think that would probably be a good solution. And from what I'm seeing, there's just so much, because this is so controversial, it's really, really difficult for committees to come to any consensus or to even want to open up the discussion, because they know it's so heated and that there's going to be such a backlash. So I think that would make sense to me, because say something like mixed martial arts right now, the criteria are that someone has had their testes removed and that they've been on hormonal treatment for 2 years. But it's questionable. Does that really level the playing field? Yeah,
and of course there's a variation of how much testosterone women have. So another case from Race Across America, when in the 90s I instituted drug testing because doping was becoming apparent in my sport. So I hired UCLA lab to run some, they were just urine tests. So we didn't have the money to do blood tests. And in any case, one of the tests for one of the women, not the two I mentioned, but another one, who was pretty masculine, actually. I wasn't surprised that her levels of testosterone were just like at the top of how you define a female. And they're like, do you want more information about this? Like, no, I'm not going to stir this up and throw her into the men's division because of she's right at the edge or something like that. I just kind of let it go. And it wasn't like she was beating everybody anyway. So it was like not a big issue, but that got me thinking, so there's obviously variation on that. So again, it's that fuzzy set. Like it's not a hard defined characteristic. It's it varies between people.
Right, and then it becomes a question of those individuals who do have higher levels of testosterone. Should they be required to then be on something like hormonal birth control to lower it?
And still be in the female division.
At the end of the day. Right. And I think it's also been unfair that certain athletes have been pointed at as the case study. I think this is medical information is personal and it should remain private. So I think the best solution would be for these committees to be able to make a decision from a panel of experts who are not ideological. But as we look to, say the Olympics, I don't know how long they're still trying to determine. The Olympics were delayed this year, but they're still trying to determine what the best policy is going to be because it is so contentious.
Right. It's in those gray area cases where it gets iffy. So you mentioned, you talk about Rachel McKinnon, formerly Veronica Ivy, who was so it was a male transitioning to a female bike racer. So of course I followed this. And, when you look at her, she's big. She's way bigger than me. And she would kick my ass on a bike. And, okay. But, so how did the women feel about this? So I looked up the two that she beat, on the podium there for the UCI, the World's Masters Track Championship. Age 35 to 44 was the age bracket. One of them supported her. The other one felt that it was, she got cheated out of a possible victory. Again, it's just one of those things you don't know if you should speak up or not, but it does seem unfair if somebody has that physical advantage. And I don't know that Rachel has transitioned long enough to have seen a difference. She says she's transitioned long enough that the hormonal differences are, she's truly a female now. But I don't know. You look at her, she's like, wow, okay. For track racing, you want to be big and bulky and strong. That's, that most track racers are, they're pretty well built that way. And so, again, that's one of those areas I don't know. I want to say something. I did say something on social media, but I don't know.
But that's the thing I see, like, even when I look around at people I know who are not invested in this, who don't follow this as part of their work, they will say gender neutral language, I'm on board with. Okay, trans women in women's spaces, that's okay. Children transitioning, okay, I guess I can accept that. But sport, that's where we draw the line. Right. So I think it's pretty funny in a way. And I do think people should be able, I think if more people felt comfortable to talk about their concerns, hopefully that would help to show that this is not hateful. This conversation should not be seen as bigoted. They're coming from a place of,
I
not
remember
hate.
when Martina Navratilova got hammered on social media, and I thought, oh boy, I'm not going to say anything. I mean, here she's a lifelong champion of gay rights and one of the greatest tennis players of all time, and she objects, to this, trans in tennis, and wow, she got handed her head on a platter.
That speaks to just how aggressive trans activists are, and they really will go after you ruthlessly if you deviate from the narrative that they want you to say. But I think the only reason they keep winning is because people bow down to them. I've been very critical of trans activism, and they still come after me, but at the same time I think they know on some level I'm not going to shut up, so they look for other targets.
Yeah. I was encouraged by Trader Joe's pushing back against the BLM movement that said that some of their products were racist. They had Trader this person, Trader Jose and Trader whatever. And they said, nope, we're keeping it. Too bad. And then it kind of died down. And I thought, okay, maybe it's more acceptable to push back and then they'll let you go or drop it.
Right. That's the thing. And I think that's part of cancel culture too, is that, well, cancel culture really is about just going after the most powerful people possible and trying to take them down so that you can benefit from that. But I think if more institutions simply said, no, we're going to back these people, we're not going to disavow them, we're not going to fire them just because the mob comes after them, that would be a big part of the solution in terms of helping to stop all of this nonsense.
Yeah, you mentioned Karsten Barasch, who beat Venus and Serena Williams 6-1, 6-2. But I looked it up, and they were only 16 and 17 at the time. And he was, kind of on the senior tour. He was a well-developed tennis player by then. It'd be interesting to see how Serena now, who's just so phenomenal, would do now and say, compared to the top 200 men, say the 200th ranked man. My sense is she would beat the 200th ranked man, but maybe not anybody in the top 100. I don't know. It's probably one of those things you couldn't do
but
now.
You can't. But you can't even say that men are likely going to they have any sort of advantage, right? Because that's considered sexist as well, to even suggest that.
Oh boy, this is crazy. All right, so let's talk about the future of the research in this area, your final chapter of the book. How long can this kind of craziness go on for?
Hopefully not much longer. It's definitely gotten a lot worse than I ever thought it would. And I'm really worried for the state of academia. I'm worried for scientific disciplines. I'm worried about sexology, my former field, which is the scientific study of sex and gender, because we see papers are being pulled. I write about a number of situations that my colleagues have faced in that chapter in terms of the pushback they have to deal with. And it's just not right. It's not right that legitimate scientists have to deal with this on top of how competitive it is to be in academia, to get funding, and to just basically keep your head above water.
Yeah. Yeah, my wife's from Germany, Cologne, Germany, actually, which is a pretty liberal city. It's got a big gay community. And when she moved here to be with me, which I still think she made a big mistake, but let's not tell her that. She was amazed at how kind of prudish Americans are about sex. Of course, Europeans are pretty open about all this stuff. And but it's no longer the religious right that's so prudish. Again, another point you make in the book. It's like the progressive left, or whatever you want to call them. They seem obsessed with what people are doing in the bedrooms now, almost like the religious right used to be.
Oh boy, especially in the context of genitals, to put it very plainly, in terms of whom you should be attracted to and whom you should be wanting to have sex with. And if you have any sort of preference in terms of who your partners are, that's considered potentially transphobic or bigoted. And especially the move, I think a lot of this gender ideology is anti-gay, because it's saying to gay people, say for lesbian women, they're being told that you should want to have sex with women regardless of their anatomy, and this includes women who may have a penis. And the definition of being a lesbian is essentially not an interest in people with a penis. So there's a huge, conversation, or I guess fight going on right now in terms of lesbians versus some trans activists in terms of where are those boundaries? Why are these lesbian women not allowed to have boundaries in terms of who their partners are?
But in terms of the long-term rights movements, do you feel like it's still moving in the right direction, or is this taking us on a detour for a while here?
I think it is taking us on a detour. I am concerned because I see the ramifications of this being quite harmful, with regards to children who are making potentially irreversible decisions about their bodies in terms of what young women are being told is acceptable in terms of how they should view themselves. And I think also just in terms of the greater understanding of who we are as human beings and our understanding of gender. And the truth always comes out. So it can be suppressed for a while, but it's going to come out. And I just think it's better to face reality sooner than later, because the longer you push it off for, the more harmful that's going to be, and the more consequences you're going to have to face as a result of that.
Yeah, another thing I was thinking about reading your book was this kind of defenestration of people in the tribe who are not perfectly aligned with the ever-changing ideology. Because I think all social movements do that. Marxist groups kind of splintered based on who was the true Marxist. Are you a Trotskyist or are you a Leninist? And feminist groups have done that. They've kind of splintered off of who's the true feminist. Objectivists, Ayn Rand fans, that they all kind of disintegrated based on, who was the purest objectivist. Atheism kind of went through that. After Dawkins' book in 2006 came out, there was kind of a division about if you were militant enough of an atheist to be called a real atheist. If not, you're just a pussy agnostic, this kind of thing. And it was like, come on, there's not very many of us.
Purity test.
Yeah. And then there was the Atheist Plus movement that came up after that, about 2010 or so, the plus being social justice. Not enough to be an atheist, you have to be an atheist plus social justice. And I first heard that, well, I'm for social justice. I didn't know what that actually meant at the time. I was like, okay, I guess I'm not really social justice, even though I am. I'm kind of a Martin Luther King Jr. kind of social justice. But the new kind seems rather different. And then you get defenestrated the moment you veer. Just remember the one of the humanist groups kind of sent out a list, like, these are the 12 things that make you a humanist. And it's like, well, I ticked like 9 or 10 of those boxes. Nope, you're out. I'm like, what? There aren't that many of us. And libertarians, same thing. It's like it's a pretty small number, not even 1%. It's like, and they're splintering and fighting over this and that. I'm like, Jesus.
Wow. Well, I write in the book about one example of one researcher who is gay, and he was doing research about the gay community, and he got funding to do his research. He got approval from his department, but the ethics committee would not approve it. And so he had to go before this committee of over 20 people to explain to justify why he should be allowed to do this research. And he, as part of this explanation, divulged the fact that he himself is gay. And they still would not allow him to do the research, and they wouldn't even give him a clear explanation as to why. And I was so upset for him, because I thought no one should have to disclose something like that as a justification for their work. And even still, how is it empowering if this committee is concerned about maybe the gay community being abused or some sort of unethical research being done? How is it then? It just seems like an overreach on their part to tell a member of the community that they can't even study their own community, and the fact that they wouldn't even tell him why. It
shouldn't matter. None of that matters. I mean, I shouldn't even have to tweet who you are, that you're Asian or this or that. It shouldn't matter. I mean, it's just you either have the facts straight or you don't. But it does matter.
Well, you're either a good scientist or you're not.
Right.
That's really what it comes down to. If you're a good scientist, none of the identity labels matter.
Right. But in terms of how we think in tribal characteristics, another example I use is when I talk about the theory of evolution to say a conservative Christian, I don't recommend Dawkins' books because they're going to go, oh, I got to be an atheist. And no. I recommend Francis Collins' book, The Language of God, it's called. And it's really one of the best defenses of the theory of evolution, as good as anything Richard's written, although he's a much better writer. But Collins is he's in that tribe. He's a Christian, right? He accepts Jesus as his savior and the whole thing. And same thing with Ken Miller, the biologist. He's a Catholic. And he defends evolution as good as anybody does. So I recommend those books, and I feel kind of funny doing that. It's like, I know why I'm doing it. I'm saying this guy is in your tribe, and he says this science is okay, as if that makes it okay. It shouldn't matter, but it seems to.
It's funny you say that, because I feel as a liberal and, someone who's written for liberal media outlets, conservatives don't seem to have as much of an issue with that when it comes to my work. They seem to have they're actually been very supportive of me. So I've been grateful of that, because that's not at all what I expected when I first started writing about these issues. So I really try to, my writing is, in terms of how I present the facts, nonpartisan. I am a columnist, so I'm allowed to be a little bit more opinionated in what I write about. But with the book, I really did try to make it nonpartisan. And I do think these issues should not be partisan issues, because at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter whether you're left or right or what your politics are. If we're denying science, we're going to pay a price for that.
Well, here's one idea I have on why that is, because I think Christians have a worldview that's closer to an evolutionary theory of human behavior than liberals do. That is to say, they couch it in different language, original sin, or you have these inner demons that you have to suppress by going to church or prayer or following the good book, and you need instruction, and you should be married, and you should have a social hierarchical structure, and you need discipline. All of that has to do with, how we are by nature. Now, they don't want to say we evolved this, because a lot of them don't like evolution, but because they think they have to give up their religion, which they don't. But the point is, I think they have a closer model to an accurate description of human nature. That is, I don't want to call it sin, but we have these characteristics that kind of need to ride herd over, violence or sex or whatever, that if they go unchecked, this kind of brings out the darker side of humanity.
And then how would you say
so
that's
that when a conservative writes you and says, "I'm glad you said that," in a way, your biological scientific theory of human sexuality is a closer match to their sort of religious view of human nature than liberals. More grossly blank slate versus biologically based, or sort of science based.
But then by the same token, I'm always surprised, because I'm, again, my research expertise was in kinky sex, and I talk a lot about sex positivity and comprehensive sex ed and gay rights. And I feel like conservatives are more willing to overlook those things, whereas, say, people on the left who agree with those things that I write about, but then don't agree about gender, are very quick to dismiss me and not want to hear anything that I have to say. So it's an interesting time where we are, because I never thought it would be like this.
Yeah, kinky sex, though, as long as it's consensual, why would anybody object to that? So let's think this through. Liberals should not object to it, but because it's you and you have these other things, they do. Conservatives might object to it because they'll think, well, this could slowly denigrate the culture, and therefore
it's perverse. To some people, it's perverse.
Yeah, it lowers moral standards, or it's like graffiti on the walls in a community. It brings down the standards, something like that. By the way, I'm kind of conflicted about things like prostitution. On the one hand, my kind of libertarian views, whatever consenting adults do, it's none of my business. But on the other hand, when you look at the abuse of young girls, say in their teens, late teens, and they're drug addicted, and they have these pimps that abuse them, they're kind of stuck, or they don't have a home to go to, and then there I kind of feel like, well, maybe this is not really consensual.
Right. I think prostitution or sex work is one of those things that's always going to be there. So it's a question of, where do you draw the lines in terms of, should it be legal, or should it be considered socially acceptable? I think, again, as long as I have the same concerns you have, but I think at the same time, it's going to be there. So
regulation?
It's a good question. It's been a while since I've thought about this issue, so it's taking me a second to get my mind back.
A related one while you're thinking about that is polygamy. Again, initially I thought, why is the government regulating marriage? Well, we know why, because the religious influence. But do they have a point there? And initially I thought, no, it's nobody's business. And you watch those shows like Sister Wives, and it's kind of funny to see this guy wrangling with 7 different wives or whatever, and the camera crews are around, and all the funny little stories. But, and again, it's okay. They're adults. They're obviously choosing to be there. When they interview them, they go, yeah, I like my sister wives. I like being married to this guy. It's all fine with me. Why is it my business here in Southern California to tell somebody in Utah what they're doing? But then you look at some of these polygamous families.
I guess it becomes
when you look at some of those,
it becomes a question of consent, though, if you're raised.
That's right. If you're 5 years old, a girl, and they're going, guess what? In 20 years, you're going to be married to this 60-year-old guy down the road. Where's the consent there?
Right. And I just think it's not helpful, again, because in that conversation, if you do say, well, maybe this is not such a good idea, or maybe more of a traditional family structure is beneficial, then you get, again, called things like bigoted or closed-minded or old-fashioned. And, I'm just about people should be free to do what they want to do as long as it's consensual.
Maybe the issue on the solution on the sex working thing is it's legal everywhere and it's regulated, that you have to be 18, you can't have been abused, you can't be on drugs, whatever, to get rid of the abusive part of the industry.
Because part of me, some of the arguments I've heard in terms of why it should be criminalized is that way it doesn't allow women who are vulnerable to make bad decisions. But part of me feels like that's extremely infantilizing of women to say that you need the government to step in and protect them. And why are we, why are we not saying that women are capable of making their own decisions? And where do you draw the line then in terms of who needs your help?
Right. Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. Yeah, government. Some old guys coming in to tell young women what they can and cannot do. Right. Yeah, reminds me of the Jehovah's Witnesses. So I had a former Jehovah's Witness on the podcast who wrote a memoir about leaving the church, and she had this incredible story in the book about when she was 15, she had a little sort of semi-sexual encounter with another boy. And the elders found out about it. So they, the tribunal, these three old guys bring this, she's like 16. All right, tell us where he touched you and what it was like. I'm like, oh my God.
Wow.
These old perverts getting off on this young girl's sex stories.
So invasive.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, no kidding.
Again, another example of how religion corrupts things.
Well, that's the thing. Sex, I think, is so unnecessarily stigmatized. And I think people sometimes, in the time that I was studying sex, I write about sex research now for a living, but people would say to me, don't you care what people think about you? And it's weird that you care so much about this stuff. And I just think, I don't think there should be anything wrong with that. It's such a big part of who we are. And especially my area of kinky sex, I've said before that I'm actually very vanilla and quite traditional monogamous myself. And people make all kinds of assumptions about me, and that's fine. That's their right to do so if they want. I think the more people who are interested in this and are doing good work, the more we're going to better understand it, and that's going to help everybody. People
lose their minds when it comes to sex. They just can't seem to think clearly about it, and I mean that even historically. You just think about how recent it was. Any good science was done. It was 1950s when the Kinsey report came out, late 50s, was that 58, 59? And, this is like shocking to people of what people are actually doing, or at least what they said they were doing. And, Kinsey was an entomologist. He studied wasps of the insect kind, not the waspy white kind. And one of the reasons that led him to do this was, he was at the University of Indiana, and they needed somebody to teach like the health class, which was supposed to have a lecture on sex. And, so he looks up in the literature and there's nothing. He's like, I don't even know what to teach because there's nothing in the scientific literature about it. So that's why he launched the whole Kinsey Report research program. But as an entomologist, he realized even like in one species of wasp, there's so much variation on characteristics, both physical and behavioral, that you have to have a huge sample. You can't ask, sample 10 wasps. You have like 1,000. And that's why he did those huge samples for sex research. And even those studies are pretty flawed, I guess. So it wasn't really until the 70s when the next big report came out. This is still pretty recent that we're even coming to grips with what humans actually like and do sexually.
The best part I have to say, though, about being a sexpert is that everyone comes to you with questions and asking about advice about their dating life or their sex life, or they say, I heard this, or my partner likes this, is this normal? Or I like this, and is this normal? That's probably the most common question I will get from people who read my work. And
they want affirmation from you that
I love it.
That it's okay, it's not some weird perverse thing.
I think so, because there's a lot of, again, shame that comes along with even people who have, in my mind, very vanilla sexual preferences. There's still a lot of shame around that, or even having a sex drive. So, yeah, I'm all about trying to reduce the stigma.
Yeah, I'm pretty vanilla myself, I guess. And so when I read some of this stuff, I think, gee, am I the pervert for not having any of these kinky preferences.
Am I the weirdo?
Oh, I love the story you told, being on a date with a guy who wanted to come across as a feminist ally. So what did he tell you? Something like, ever since I met you, I find porn unattractive, or the women in porn are unattractive. And you're like, who is this bullshitter? Come on.
He literally said on a first date, and I generally don't write about my personal life, but I felt this was too good of an example to pass up. And he said, when he is dating someone, he doesn't find other women attractive and doesn't feel the need to look at pornography. And because I know my expertise was in male sexuality, I almost understand male sexuality better than female sexuality. I thought, this is not true at all. This person is clearly telling me this for whatever reasons he thinks I'm going to like him or something like that. But I just think it's about, be honest with your partners. You don't need to,
like, he was virtue
play
signaling.
silly games like that. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I've noticed that in a lot of guys trying to signal to women, I'm a feminist too, by saying things that are like that. Obviously not true.
And the thing is too, for I think young women especially, who believe that good men will behave exactly like them because men and women are at the core the same, and so any differences are due to sexism. So they will look for male partners who are identical to them, not just in their views, but their behavior. So the only men who are going to be exactly like them in their sexual behavior are men who are lying to them, because men and women are on average different. Not to say that, again, I have to give the caveat of course, that not all men and women act completely, not all men act like men, not all men prefer casual sex, and not all women prefer relationships or things like that, but on average. And so as a young woman, most of the men you encounter, if you're straight, are going to fall into a certain way of behavior and a way of thinking about sex and relationships. And if he tells you that he thinks the same way you do, he's probably lying.
Right. So when you said when you were growing up, you were female atypical, I think is how you described that. So you like wearing short jeans and a t-shirt or whatever rather than a dress. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Or you have long hair, you don't have short hair, right? And so I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Right. I had a shaved head when I was younger.
You shaved your head?
I did. I'm very female typical now, but I still feel very masculine, which often surprises people. I've always looked more like, when I was younger, I looked like a boy. I dressed like a boy. All my friends are boys. Even as an adult, I very rarely will wear dresses or girly type clothing, but I don't think that makes me any less of a woman. I just think I'm a different kind of woman. And so I really encourage other women who feel like that. I think that's perfectly acceptable. We don't have to be another category of gender. We don't need to be anything other than women.
Well, that's kind of a spectrum in a sense then. Within the frame, there's a little variation there.
I just think to delineate and try to separate individuals based on differences within one sex category, I don't see why we can't just all be women.
Right. Yeah, right. Or just individuals. You, Deborah, this is what you like. Why do we have to put a label on it and call it something? I mean, I guess that used to be called a tomboy or something like that. I don't think that term is probably offensive now. I don't even know.
Right. And I totally own that. And the same thing with men who are maybe less male typical. I think they're still men. Just because you're a feminine man doesn't mean you're not a man.
Right. Yeah, I hope so. I don't even know what I am anymore. I'm just a dude.
What did you say in your email to me? You said that you're an okay boomer.
Yeah, I'm an okay boomer. Yeah, that's I found that was a term applied to Obama a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago now, and he made some comment online. They go, "Oh, that's a typical okay boomer." He's barely a boomer. I'm 10 years older than him, so I'm in the kind of the middle of the boomer. Yeah, so we're
right. You could be a Karen also.
Yeah, that's right. If I was a female out complaining about things and vocalizing and yelling at the people at the park, I'd be a Karen. Get off my lawn.
Yeah. Where's the manager?
I try to stay up with things. I mean, it's one of the reasons I like staying in the classrooms. I'm a presidential fellow at Chapman. I just teach one class, but I like being around young students just so I kind of have some idea of the changing landscape. And definitely the iGeners or Gen Z, they're definitely different than millennials, I can tell.
In what way?
Yeah, just like the phrase, people who identify as a woman. I mean, when I first came across that, I went, well, who's that? Women. I mean, what are you talking about? Well, there's this small subset of, okay, all right, it's 1% or whatever, 0.01, whatever the percentage is, it's small. And yes, of course, we should not discriminate and so on. But, how many people are we really talking about here that we need to change the language? On the other hand, language does matter. I mean, when I was, say, in my 20s is when the whole he, she thing, in language and not referring to Mrs. but Ms. That kind of came online in the late 60s, early 70s. And I kind of made those adjustments like, okay, it's such a small thing to do. And don't use the N word. Yeah, of course. All right. Got that.
Well, of course.
And, there's some, sort of easy pickings. Yes, these are the easy things to do. That's why when I first saw Jordan make a big deal about that, I thought, man, is that really a place to, sort of the hill to die on? I don't know. It's such a small thing to me, it's not a big deal. Although I suppose if you legislated it and fine companies, that, that would be kind of, I would not like that. But personally, it's such a small thing. Language does seem to matter to a certain extent.
My issue also, so along with the quote unquote I identifiers or someone who identifies as whichever sex, it's also the sex assigned at birth.
Oh, yeah.
Even though sex is not assigned at birth,
right.
Your sex is what it is. And I think that's coming from people wanting to acknowledge the intersex community, which I think is a good thing. But again, the intersex people make up as many as 1% of the population. So it's still a very small percentage. And for the vast majority of babies that are born, the doctor is not assigning the sex. The doctor's approximation of sex is going to be correct.
Yeah, for 99% of the cases. And that in that 1%, we won't even know for decades, like your colleague that or the example you gave of the woman that published the paper with mice and dutifully said, 50% were female and 50, no, you can't say that. They identify. I don't know what they identify as. The mice didn't tell me what their gender was.
Yeah. Yes, its ideology is everywhere, and it's really pretty terrifying when you see the extent to where it's spread its tentacles.
Wow. Well, let's hope the pendulum that swung way out here will swing back toward more modest a more modest center, let's say. So what's next for you? So you're making your living now as a journalist, full-time writer, and researcher on your own. Where can people find you? And you have your own webpage and so forth.
Yes, so you can find me on Twitter and Facebook at Dr. Debra Soh, on Instagram at Dr. Deborah W. Soh, and as you mentioned, my website is drdebrasoh.com, and you can find The End of Gender on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Indigo, if you're Canadian like me, indie booksellers, pretty much everywhere you get books, and there's the audiobook is narrated by me as well.
I love the audiobook. So you don't have any TikTok videos?
Oh my goodness!
See, even you're already too old. You're being left behind now.
I criticized TikTok on social media the other day, and I was amazed at how angry people got. I thought TikTokers are very very defensive.
That's really funny. Yeah, and you can't even leave your country now, right? You couldn't come to America for a book tour because if you went home, you'd be quarantined for 2 weeks.
For 2 weeks, yeah. So I could technically have gone down there as work because the border is open for work. It's still closed for non-essential travel, but technically this would have been work for me. But my concern was more the fact that they're booking the planes fully now. And so say going down to California is a 5-hour flight, and I'm not sure how I would keep the mask on for that long and not get hungry or thirsty. I mean, I would have loved to be there. It really pained me not to be able to travel as part of my book tour. But it is what it is.
So what's next for you on a book front?
This has been my first week of press. I'll be doing more press.
No, I mean future books.
In the future. Future books. Well, I think that's going to be a secret for now. I do have a couple of ideas, but I'm just really happy that this one is out now. I was really afraid that it was going to be potentially pulled by activists, so I didn't actually tell anyone. I told maybe 3 people in my life that I was writing a book when I signed a book deal because I was afraid that it might get pulled.
You mean that they would write your publisher?
And even still, since it's come out, there's been all the hoopla. I mean, one of our most prominent columnists in Canada, Barbara Kay, so she wrote a review of my book, and she had been writing with the National Post, which is one of our prominent newspapers, for 20 plus years. And she ended up resigning from her position because they wouldn't run the review because it was a positive review. So that was, I think, a decision that came after a number of experiences that she had that she was not happy with. But that's one example. And then we see on social media, my interview with Joe Rogan is being flagged as I'm not sure the term that Twitter uses, but it's something that needs to be hidden.
They talk about sex. Yeah. Oh no. And they're not far left progressive. I don't know what Joe is. Maybe he's a sort of left leaning, left of center, maybe. I don't know. Hard to say.
I think he considers himself progressive, but I don't want to speak for him.
Well, the thing about cancel culture that's so destructive is it's not just that they disagree with you or they want to debate you. They want to destroy you. They want to harm your ability to make a living. Yeah, I did a little Twitter burst on this last week on this because I've debated Dinesh D'Souza, I don't know, half a dozen times over the years. And, I really disagree with him. He's a pretty hardcore Christian conservative. He's a big Trump supporter and on and on. There's few things we agree on. But I couldn't imagine writing to his employees or his publishers and demanding that they stop paying him and he can't make a living. Who would do that? I mean, what's the point of that? That has nothing to do with his ideas. There's something else going on here with this that's really troublesome.
I think it's people who are very vindictive and who can't stand to see other people who are successful. Because as you said, there's no reason why you can't debate someone and agree to disagree. Or even if someone does something that you find offensive, to let that be known. But is that a reason to have their livelihood destroyed and ruin the chances of them ever having work again and making it so that everyone in society basically wants nothing to do with them? I don't think that's a path for redemption. I don't think someone who gets canceled like that thinks I made a mistake and I need to do better. If anything, they're going to feel more justified in how they behaved.
Yeah, worse, and it backfires. Some of my cycling buddies are conservatives, and they've pretty much been pulled along with the moral arc like everybody else. They're pretty socially liberal now, but when they encounter the kind of stuff you're writing about, they think, you know what, these people have lost their fucking minds. I am not going to support this whole thing anymore. It just backfires. It's like, that's gone too far. I'm like, yeah, that's the problem.
Right. And the activists don't see it that way. And instead of taking that criticism into consideration and thinking, how can we be a little bit more reasonable with this? They double down and they go even further left. And so that's leading to even more of the polarization that we're seeing. Yeah.
Well, Deborah, I know you got some other interviews coming up here. You're in the middle of your book tour. So thanks for taking so much time to talk to me. Really love your work.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Keep being brave.
Thank you.
Don't read the comments, as Joe told you. I learned this long ago. Do not read the comments. My webmaster occasionally sends me a link. He says, have you seen what people are saying? No, I said, don't send me the link. I don't even want to look. It'll ruin my day. I'm going for a bike ride.
Yeah, you enjoy the weather over there.
Definitely. All right. Thanks, Deborah.